Hello and welcome back to my channel. This is part 2 of the Hi-Point 4595 TS Carbine review. During this presentation, I'm going to show you how I perform maintenance on the Hi-Point 4595 TS Carbine. That, in fact, is the same procedure that I use on the Hi-Point 995 TS Carbine, or would for any Hi-Point PCC. First of all, Hi-Point does not even recommend tear down and cleaning until 1,500 to 2,000 rounds. Some of us, however, like to keep our firearms well maintained, and that may mean cleaning after receiving the firearm and after every range session, regardless of the number of cartridges fired. I also need to mention that this presentation addresses deep cleaning of the Hi-Point carbine, and not a quick clean by running a bore snake through the bore, wiping down of the firearm, or maybe even cleaning the bolt face. I will take you through a disassembly of the firearm, up to the point where further disassembly is no longer advised by the manufacturer. Now, let me show you each category that I will be presenting. First, I'll show you the tools and materials that I use to maintain the firearm. Next, I'll take you through the necessary safety check to ensure that the firearm is safe to work on. Then comes the procedures and steps for disassembling the firearm for cleaning and lubrication. I'll show you how I clean the firearm, what chemicals I use, and what I will show, what Hi-Point does not, what to lubricate, and what I use to do so. After cleaning and lubrication, I'll take you through the steps to properly assemble the firearm. Finally, I'll show you how I perform a function test of the firearm. So, let's get started by taking a look at the tools and materials you will need. You will need the Hi-Point tool or comparable tools, such as a small flat-tip screwdriver, a small nylon punch, a 5/16 inch box end wrench, nut driver, or socket, a 5/64 inch hex key or comparable for front sight removal if you decide to remove it, a small hammer, a laser or red dot sight for aligning the front sight if you removed it. You will need bore cleaning tools such as a carbine length cleaning rod, a bore brush, a bore mop if you decide to use one, cleaning patch jag or holder, and a bore snake, which is optional. You will also need cleaning brushes, nylon and brass or bronze, cleaning patches, rags, etc., cleaning chemicals of your choice, lubricating oils of your choice, snap caps, this is optional, but is something that I use, and blue thread locker, which is optional. This is for securing the operating handle bolt. Next, I'll take you through the necessary safety check to ensure that the firearm is safe to work on. To perform a safety check, first remove the magazine by pressing the magazine release button in. If the magazine does not fall out, then simply pull the magazine out of the grip and set it aside. Push the thumb safety fully downward to the off fire position. Note that the thumb safety must be in the off or fire position to allow the breech bolt to be removed when we get to disassembling the firearm. While holding the grip and with your finger off of the trigger and outside of the trigger guard, grasp the operating handle with your other hand and pull the operating handle fully back to eject any cartridge that may be in the chamber. Lock the breech bolt to the rear, the open position, by pushing the operating handle roller into the round opening in the receiver shroud slot until it locks in the open position. Once the breech bolt is locked to the rear, visually and physically inspect the chamber and the magazine well of the Hi-Point carbine to be sure that no ammunition remains in either place. Once you are sure that the Hi-Point carbine is unloaded, slowly release the breech bolt. Next, with the firearm pointed in a safe direction, pull the trigger to release the striker. Note that although it is possible to disassemble the firearm with the striker cocked, it is much easier to remove the breech bolt with the striker released. Alright, that completes the safety check portion. We now know that the firearm is safe and ready to be worked on. Alright, let me show you how I do a top-down breakdown or a disassembly of the Hi-Point 4595 TS carbine. Okie dokie, my loins are girded and I'm ready for action. Nurse, I'm going in. Let's dig into disassembling the Hi-Point. Using the Hi-Point tool, a 5/16" box end wrench, or a socket, I'll remove the operating handle by unscrewing it from the breech bolt. Using the Hi-Point tool or a small flat tip screwdriver, I'll roll the rail lock fully up and back to unlock the fore-end cover. Now I need to push or pull forward on the fore-end cover, lift it off, and set it aside. While pressing the shroud pins inward from the head side, I am rotating the shroud clips clockwise with the Hi-Point tool or a small nylon punch to unlock them. Using the screwdriver end of the Hi-Point tool or a pin punch, I push the shroud pins out of the receiver shroud and set them aside. Then I remove the receiver shroud assembly by lifting the front of the receiver shroud and pulling it off. Note that there is no need to remove the optic if one is mounted. I will begin removing the fire assembly by removing the receiver clip on the bottom side of the firearm with the Hi-Point tool or a pin punch by tapping it forward off the receiver lug with a small hammer. Now I'll remove the firing assembly by lifting up on the front of the barrel. To completely remove the breech bolt from the firing assembly, first remove the front sight by loosening the two set screws on the bottom of the front sight base with a 5/64 hex key. Set the front sight assembly aside. I'll talk about how to align the front sight later in the assembly procedure. In my case, however, I need to remove the flash suppressor, and I'm not going to bore you with that. With the front sight or other adapter removed from the muzzle end of the barrel, remove the barrel frame support by sliding it off the muzzle of the barrel. Set it aside for later installation. Using the Hi-Point tool or a flat screwdriver, I need to slide the breech bolt retainer clip back to release the breech bolt retainer. Next, I must push the breech bolt back approximately 3/8 of an inch to clear the striker from the barrel and lift the back of the breech bolt up and over the barrel, sliding it to the front of the firearm. I must use caution here. The breech bolt is under spring tension from the main recoil spring, and the main recoil spring may fly out. Now, to slide the breech bolt out over the muzzle to completely remove the breech bolt. Then note that the breech bolt contains the retainer, striker, and springs, so I must be careful that they do not fall out. I must now pull the bolt retainer out of the back of the breech bolt, then turn the breech bolt upside down and allow the striker spring, striker assist spring, and striker to slide out the back. Next, I'll pull the main recoil spring forward and out of the frame. This completes the disassembly of the Hi-Point carbine, at least as far as Hi-Point advises, and as far as I'm willing to take it. Never disassemble your Hi-Point carbine further. Any further disassembly by an untrained person could cause your Hi-Point carbine to malfunction and will void the warranty. Also, do not pull the trigger with the breech bolt removed. The sear is under spring tension and could fly out. This completes the disassembly of the Hi-Point carbine, at least as far as Hi-Point advises, and as far as I'm willing to take it. With the Hi-Point carbine disassembled, let me show you how I clean and lubricate the firearm. You may develop your own method later, but this procedure may help you get started. The more time that you spend with a firearm, the better you get to know it. Getting to know a firearm is not only important from an operational standpoint, but also from a maintenance point of view. A firearm will usually tell you what is going on with it, if you take the time to observe what it is telling you. So, where to start? There are a lot of parts to be cleaned. There has to be some sort of order to ensure that all parts are cleaned properly and completely before lubrication. I also need to touch on the safety aspect of cleaning. Always wear safety glasses when cleaning to protect your eyes from cleaning materials. Only use commercially available gun solvents and gun oils or a cleaner lubricant preservative. Use of improper cleaning fluids can damage your Hi-Point carbine. The frame has a powder coat finish. Do not use acetones, gun scrubber, or harsh solvents that may remove the coating. Test new cleaning products on a small surface before using them. With that out of the way, I'm going to start with the barrel assembly, which also incorporates a whole host of parts. The first thing that I do is pre-soak the inside of the barrel. I use a quick grip clamping system that allows me to keep the barrel assembly, any barrel assembly, upright so that gravity and cleaning materials can do their jobs. I thoroughly soak the inside of the barrel with ballistol and then set the barrel assembly aside while I move on to cleaning other things, like all of the small parts. I just simply wipe down all of the small parts, like the firing pin and springs, or striker if you prefer, assembly pins, recoil spring and guide rod, receiver clip, etc. At this point, I inspect the firing pin to ensure it is still straight. I mentioned in my review of the Hi-Point 4595 TS that the firing pin can be bent due to several causes, but primarily due to the operator short stroking the action when loading. You might notice that I use a magnetic tray to keep all the small parts from going wayward on me. This is just some insurance that I have to ensure that all the parts are together when I get ready to assemble the firearm. As the barrel assembly is soaking, I turn my attention to the breech bolt, which is a party in itself, since it houses the striker springs, and bolt retainer, and ejector keys that are actually the extractors. Using bronze and nylon brushes, patches, Q-tips, and cleaning patches, the breech bore is cleaned thoroughly and then set aside so that I can return my attention to the barrel assembly that has been soaking. There are a lot of nooks and crannies to clean in the barrel assembly that houses the trigger assembly, safety counterweight and counterweight pivot, sear, safety mechanism, etc., all of which I do not want to disturb, just clean. The bore is cleaned from the chamber end using Hoppy's No. 9, bore mops, and judicious scrubbing. My last act of cleaning the bore is to run a bore snake with the tail end coated with ballistol. This firearm will not be shot again for quite a while, and I want to ensure that the bore is ready for storage. Wipe the outside of the magazine and the feed lips with a clean patch that has been slightly dampened with gun cleaning solvent or a cleaner lubricant preservative. Wipe the outside of the magazine and the feed lips with a clean patch and examine it. If it is not clean, repeat until the patch remains clean. Check the magazine to make sure the follower and lips are not damaged. Press down on the follower with your fingertip and release it to make sure that it springs back up and does not catch inside the magazine tube. Finally, and with everything clean to my satisfaction, it's time to move on to lubricating the firearm. Hi-Point does not provide information about lubrication. Therefore, I'm going to make an attempt to highlight some of the areas of the 4595 TS that should be lubricated and which were determined by observing wear patterns as best I could. For lubricating the majority of my firearms, I normally use two choices of lubrication, ballistol and Wilson Combat Ultima Lube Oil. I apply both as sparingly as possible. Note that lubrication points and lubricants are my personal choices. Yours may differ. These are my choices of lubrication points. The face of the breech bolt at the firing pin channel. Only a light film is needed. The firing pin channel. I use ballistol and sparingly. Hi-Point recommends a very light film of oil to assist the firing pin in its travel. Luckily, the firing pin channel is very easy to clean and the firing pin is loosely fitted. The surface of the slide that contacts the trigger bar. The surfaces where the sear cam and trigger bar contact. The sear pin that protrudes through the sear cam. I use ballistol at this point. Beneath the sear cam arm. The sear cam pivot point. The face of the sear where it contacts the firing pin. I also lubricate the counterweight pivot point. With the cleaning and lubrication completed, I think that it's time we move on to the next topic. Now that we have disassembled, cleaned, and lubricated the Hi-Point carbine, just might be a good idea to put this thing back together. What do you say? Yeah, I think so too. I'll begin the assembly process by first installing the firing pin spring, and firing pin assist spring into the channel in the rear of the breech bolt. The breech bolt retainer is installed into the breech bolt by holding the cylindrical part and inserting the rounded part with the spring guide facing forward into the channel at the rear of the breech bolt. Install the recoil spring and guide rod into the frame by pushing them into the area of the frame below the barrel with the guide rod facing forward. Place the breech bolt with the retainer, springs, and firing pin over the barrel all the way to the recoil spring. With your finger off of the trigger, align the tab on the bottom of the breech bolt below the opening for the barrel with the end of the main spring guide and pull the breech bolt over the barrel. Continue to pull the breech bolt over the barrel, aligning the breech bolt retainer with the retainer hole in the frame. Note that when pulling the breech bolt over the barrel, be careful to pull it back far enough to clear the firing pin, if it is protruding from the breech face, to avoid bending the firing pin. While holding down on the breech bolt, make sure the retainer clip hole is aligned with the bottom of the retainer and push the breech bolt all the way down. With a nylon punch and hammer, push the retainer clip forward to lock the breech bolt retainer in place. Place the frame support over the muzzle end of the barrel and slide it back firmly onto the front lug of the firing assembly. Make sure that the retainer clip is properly locked through the slot in the breech bolt retainer and not under it. The firearm may still fire, but the breech bolt will not be properly locked in place, which could lead to serious personal injury and/or damage to the firearm. Install the firing assembly into the stock with the rear of the assembly first. Push the front of the firing assembly down into the stock so that the receiver lug protrudes through the bottom of the stock. Hold the stock and firing assembly with the bottom lug facing up. With the small bend facing away from the stock, place the receiver clip into the slots of the receiver lug. Then push it all the way over the lug until it is firmly seated. Note that using a nylon punch and hammer to seat the retainer clip works well. Install the receiver shroud back end first onto the stock, making sure that the shroud support plate goes inside the stock. Push the front of the receiver shroud down into place. Make sure that the shroud clips are rotated clockwise so that the large circular area of the slots is over the receiver shroud holes. Push the receiver shroud pins through the shroud, stock, and receiver until they protrude through the opening in the shroud clips. Pushing firmly on the head of the receiver shroud pins to compress the springs, use the back end of the Hi-Point tool to push the shroud clips counterclockwise and lock them into place onto the shroud pins. You can also use a small, non-marring nylon punch. Place the fore-end cover on the front of the stock over the barrel. Make sure the rail lock is in the open position. Align the mounting slots, push the fore-end cover down, and then slide the fore-end cover back under the top rail until it is seated all the way against the receiver shroud. Rotate the rail lock forward to lock the fore-end cover into place. Reinstall the front sight over the muzzle of the barrel and push it firmly into the front rail slot. Note that it may be necessary to slightly pull down on the front of the rail to slide the sight all the way back in. Sight down the barrel to align the front sight straight, and then tighten the two set screws firmly with a 5/64 hex key or equivalent. An alternative method to align the front sight is to use the rear sight. You may also use a red dot, laser, or even the scope set at a low magnification setting to align the front sight. If you desire, add a drop of blue thread locker to several of the operating handle threads. Install the operating handle and roller by screwing it into the side of the bolt through the left side in the receiver shroud. Tighten, but do not over-tighten the operating handle with the Hi-Point tool or a 5/16 inch equivalent tool. The assembly of the Hi-Point carbine is now complete. Well, it's back together. Everything's in place and there are no parts left over. I think assembly's complete. There's only one more thing to do until I can let you get back to what you were doing before you decided to stop in and spend some time with me. That's right, function testing. So, let's get to it. After assembling your Hi-Point carbine or remedying a malfunction, you should perform a function test to ensure that it is operating correctly, and I'm going to tell you just how to do that. Note that I use a snap cap to check functioning, which allows me to test for firing, extraction, and ejection. First, insert an unloaded magazine into the magazine well and make sure that it is noticeably locked into place. With the thumb safety fully down in the off or fire position, pull the operating handle back as far as it will go and release it to make sure that it is held in the open position by the internal breech bolt lock. Press the magazine release and make sure that the magazine can be easily removed from the magazine well. Leave the magazine out of the firearm. While holding the firearm, grasp the operating handle with your other hand. Pull the handle fully back and then release it to ensure that it returns to the fully forward position. Do this several times to make sure that it moves freely. Pull the operating handle to the full rearward position and push the handle roller into the round opening in the receiver shroud slot to manually lock open the bolt. Load a magazine with snap caps. I normally load 4 or 5 for testing purposes. Insert a snap cap loaded magazine into the magazine well and make sure that it is noticeably locked into place. Pull the charging handle fully to the rear, release it quickly, and ensure that the bolt goes fully forward and chambers the snap cap. With the thumb safety fully upward in the on, safe position, and the muzzle pointed in a safe direction, attempt to pull the trigger to ensure that the striker is not released. Move the thumb safety fully down to the off or fire position and pull the trigger to ensure that the striker is released. Pull the operating handle fully to the rear, the snap cap should be extracted and ejected. Perform this several times to ensure proper firing, extraction, and ejection. The bolt should lock back when all the snap caps have been ejected. This will complete function testing. Wow, man, we have covered a lot of ground during this presentation. First, we learned what tools and materials are needed to properly maintain the Hi-Point PCC. We obviously needed to know how to perform a proper safety check of the firearm. We also learned how to properly disassemble the Hi-Point PCC, and that it is necessary to perform deep cleaning of the firearm. In the cleaning and lubrication segment, you learned how I clean and properly lubricate the firearm. You will, no doubt, develop a technique that may differ from mine, and that is all right. The main point is that a properly cleaned and lubricated firearm will keep it ready when you are ready to use it. I think that we can all agree that properly assembling a firearm is tantamount to its operation. In the assembly segment, you learned how to do that. And finally, performing function checks ensure that not only is the firearm safe to operate, but that it is up to the rigors of sending projectiles downrange to the target. You probably have noted that I did not cover installing any options like magnified optics, red dots, or lasers and lights, or muzzle add-ons, just the basic firearm. I have finally come to the end of this journey, and I do thank you for spending this time with me. Otherwise, I would just be talking to myself. I hope that you will stop back in for the Hi-Point 4595 Optics project and for other gun and gear reviews. Until that time, stay safe out there.